This morning about new boundaries for robotics, how far from being some of the machines you saw when you walked into the Science Museum transforming factories 100 years ago, we're now seeing robots engaged in caring industries, whether it's for young children or for older people. So the world is changing. And similarly, when it comes to some of the world of AI and machine learning we talked about this morning, it's not the world of telling a machine what to do and it doing it really well is far behind us, and we are now into a different era. So we have got a big debate going on about what is going on with the world of work and machines, how's it going to change it, is nobody going to have a job because of the future developments of machine. My basic take, to skip to the end of this, is that the only way you're not going to have a job because of the robots is if you write a book about robots, in which case you can retire very fast, because it is a booming industry, and anyone not doing it should get on with it fast. That's the debate we're going to have today. For the panel we have to do that for us is Michael Osborne, who is the Dyson professor, not just a professor, but Dyson professor, in machine learning at Oxford, so you can tell you actually what machine learning is. We have Orna, non-exec director of the Royal Mail Group, a background in retail, and she's going to touch on some of the real-world examples of how automation is changing a diverse range of sectors. Sarah O'Connor from the FT, who is the employment correspondent, is going to give us a millennials' youthful, optimistic take on this changing world. And Alan, who is not a millennial but is optimistic, Alan Manning from the LSE, is going to take us through some of this slides. So just to kick us off, we're going to take you through some work that we at the Resolution Foundation have done about how we think the world of work has changed from automation in the past and what that might mean going forward. So why don't we kick that off? So now I apologise for the title here. I have a very enthusiastic team at the Resolution Foundation. I'm told this is a robot from a program called Robot Wars. It is apparently called Sir Kilowatt. It individually is obviously going to take all of the jobs. So, first of all, a bit of optimistic background. The UK has got the highest employment rate we have ever had. That is very good news for lots of different reasons, but not least that high employment is one of the most progressive ways of sharing income around the country. In general, if you increase employment, it tends to be a low-income person who increase it with. There are some exceptions, but in general, that's what's going on. So that is the background good news about the British economy. It's now actually over 74%, if you update the slide. Today, and we've never seen that in our history. Right, despite all that big good news, there is a lot of angst out there. As I said, the way to make a lot of money is to write a book about robot angst. Here is just a random sample of 9 newspaper headlines about how the robots are taking all our jobs. Hopefully you can see some of them. Automation will mark the end of our work-obsessed society, says The Guardian. That's the optimistic take. Robots could replace over 5 million jobs, the Telegraph, and this isn't just the UK. Goodbye jobs, welcome machines, says Die Zeit. So even the Germans are worried about losing their jobs. So that even in that world of everyone having a job, people are worried. Now, why are they worried? Because studies, this is a bar charts by different countries showing you 2 different estimates of how many jobs are at risk of being automated in roughly the next 2 decades. So the white bars is probably from a paper most of you have heard of by Frey and Osborne. Michael Osborne is here. So this is somebody else taking their work and extending it to many more developed countries. But it roughly shows you that they think up to 50% of jobs are at some risk of automation in I think in a non-specified, roughly 2 decades time period. The dark blue bars within that are from a separate OECD paper, done in a different way, but estimating their take of how many jobs are at risk of automation. Now, 2 things to note here. One, the numbers are quite different. We'll have a debate about that. You'll all have views about where they should actually come out. But 2, there's a consensus that a decent chunk of jobs in the labour market are at some risk of being done by machines at some point. And that is the macro underpinning thing here, rather than, we can do our own algorithms and come to like 30% down the middle somewhere, so you all have your own views, but that's the general trend. Now, history tells us that might not be a bad way of thinking about it, because the calculations behind those figures on the previous slide were based on looking at individual jobs or tasks within individual jobs and about how routine those tasks are, and taking that as a measure of how easily a machine could do them. So what we've done here is to take the change in hours worked relative to the total hours worked in the economy over time, and to see how much the level of routineness of jobs predicted what has happened to jobs between 1993 and 2015-16. And what it basically shows you is that there is a pretty strong correlation, i.e., jobs that were routine and therefore suitable to be automated saw a decline. That's the jobs on the right-hand side, office clerks, machine operators, plant operators, saw a decline, it says up to 40% in how much of total hours worked they made up. Whereas jobs that were hard to automate, health professionals, personal services at the top left there, have seen an increase in the amount of the labour market they make up. So whatever you think about the individual numbers on the previous slide, the issue they are raising is what has happened for chunks of the past. And before we get on to some of the macro picture of what happened to jobs during that period, I just want to highlight that in individual sectors, this is employment jobs in individual sectors from 1995 to 2015, in sectors that were particularly affected by automation. And the thing I want to get across is that some sectors did see very large falls in the number of jobs. This is not some like abstract change, as Orna will come on to in some of the sectors she works in later. Some sectors have seen a halving of the number of jobs they have over that 20-year period. Like machines do matter for the job people do in the real world. Now, in some of these sectors, the combination of machines and globalization together has led to very fast falls. Lots of manufacturing jobs have obviously gone elsewhere. Leather goods manufacturing is what you might call shoes in other parts of the world. Clearly, that is not being done in the UK except for the top end anymore. And for the people affected by that, whatever I'm about to say about the macro jobs effect, clearly that's a real thing. If you were working in those sectors, you no longer have a job, that is bad for you, even if overall employment is still high. And that is particularly true, which isn't true in these four examples, but if you were in a sector which was very geographically focused, i.e. there was one big factory in the town and it closed. It's all well and good me saying there are lots of jobs overall, but for people in that town, things felt pretty rubbish for a few years while that transition worked its way through. So this is the non-complacency slide before I get on to some complacency. Now, here's some pretty charts. Now, this is the hollowing out thesis, which is an argument that's grown over the last 5 years about how that automation I showed you on the previous two slides has led to changes in the overall nature of jobs that are available in the economy. So, from left to right, the least skilled jobs are on the left-hand side, and the most skilled jobs are on the right-hand side. Anything going up has increased as a share of the economy over the last 20 years, and anything going down is smaller. And the black line, each of the circles represents an industry or occupation, and the black line is the average of all the circles. And what it's basically showing you is jobs in the middle have decreased over the last 20 years. And by jobs in the middle, I mean jobs that were in the middle of the occupational earnings distribution in 1993. So if you were in a middle paid job in 1993, there are less of those jobs now than there were then. But here's what I want to highlight is the growth in jobs, so the middle is less, and that's all the debate in the US about how all the good jobs have gone, the middle class has disappeared, and everyone's now doing rubbish jobs, which is true for large amounts of the US. In the UK, over the last 20 years, it is not true, and that is because these are good jobs being created at the top of what was the earnings distribution back in 1993. So the likes of teachers and professors, which I'll come back to in a second, business jobs, science jobs, management jobs. Now, we shall get into a debate later about what all these jobs are, what they mean, but the point is, it's not right to say that the middle jobs have gone and everyone's now doing rubbish jobs at the bottom. That is not what's happening to the labour market as a whole. Just focusing a second on the jobs that have gone, to follow back to our routines point earlier, just to take those four dots at the bottom, the coloured dots, you've basically got manufacturing jobs, process plant machine operatives and skilled metal electrical trades seeing big falls, and then another neck of the labour market, administrative and secretarial jobs also falling. That is the core of the hollowing out thesis. Right, so there's been a hollowing out of jobs, but has there been a hollowing out of the pay distribution? If we thought that what I just showed you totally reflected what's going on in the labour market, we would expect to see less people earning in the middle. This is the pay distribution. A handful of people earn 3 times the median over here. Most people earn, what a shock, just slightly less than the median of the typical workers' wages. So how has that changed between 1993, which is this blue line, and today? Not a lot. So there's hollowing out of jobs, yes. Hollowing out of earnings and pay, no. Hasn't happened over the last 20 years. And remember, this is against the background of a large increase in inequality in the 1980s, but not in Britain during this time period. The only changes you can really see, you see that red line being slightly higher at the bottom, around 0.6%, 0.6 times of the typical hourly pay. That is called the national minimum wage being introduced halfway through this phase. And this red line being slightly higher here at the bottom is called there being a few more rich people in the country over the last 20 years. You probably noticed them because they're walking around Kensington now. Kensington's a lot prettier than it was in the 1980s. I don't know if you noticed. Right, then just briefly, like what is going on there? This hollowing out of jobs is happening, but people's pay isn't changing. And the answer is, we hollowed out the jobs, yes, and then the labour market has filled those jobs back in again. So this is a graph showing by pay decile of occupations, so similar to that first graph, where have the jobs been lost within each decile, and where have they been created within that decile? And it is locked, so they have to sum, each decile has to sum to the same, because any jobs that were lost have to be made up because the decile is fixed. So I just want to highlight two things. One is, you see this light blue bar on the top, so the growth sectors, which is teaching and protective services. Protective services are a posh way of saying the police and other things. You're seeing a big increase in jobs in the middle. That occupation sector is filling in the middle of the labour market for jobs that have gone, I just mentioned, in manufacturing and admin. And they have cut, that is because we've got more teachers and they are relatively less well paid than they were in the 1990s. And they are filling out this middle of the income distribution. There's lots of things going on here, but mostly cover what we've said. As you can tell, there are a lot more managers who are doing quite well right at the top. That's the 10th decile. You basically can't do, there's less teachers, as you can see. We've taken them all out of the top decile, but there's a lot of managers. You want to be a manager in 21st century Britain, it turns out. Now, so that's what's overall going on. Some jobs have gone. That will have been difficult for those affected, but macro, the jobs have just been taken by other positions. Doesn't mean that will always happen, but that's what's happened in the past. So, given all those scare stories, why might we think that we actually need more robots rather than less? First proof point. The UK has got the most catastrophic productivity growth, one, compared to our history, and two, compared to most countries, although most are having a version of this. So this shows UK productivity growth from 1971 on the left-hand side, right the way up to today. And as you can see, the UK has had no productivity growth since 2007. And remember, the reason this matters is, in the end, productivity growth is the long-term driver of living standards growth. It is not happening. And in the end, technology is one of the major drivers, and only long-term driver of that productivity growth. So we'd quite like some more of that, please, and robots are part of that. As we've just seen, they're quite exciting, and hopefully they can answer a lot of our problems. This is the topical bit of the case for robots, which is the British people have voted for us to leave the European Union. There is now, you might have noticed, it's been in the news a bit. Now, there is now a big row about what is our ongoing trade relationship with the EU and our migration policy towards EU migrants. Here's the issue. Some sectors of the UK economy are very dependent on migrant labour. So this is just a number of them. Food manufacturing, over 30% of people working in food manufacturing are EU migrants today. Now these are some of the other hard ones. Domestic staff is over 20%, accommodation likewise. Agriculture in a wider sense, I think agriculture includes hunting in this measure for some reason, is over 15%. So there are sectors of the economy that are going to have to think seriously if we're going to see a change in migration policy, which it looks like from the politicians that are standing for the Tory leadership, and likely the next Prime Minister, we're going to see some change. We'll have to think about how they do their business. What is the business model in these sectors without EU migration available to them? Now, then we come to robots, and robots are not available to be used in all sectors in the same way. So the gold star is showing you relatively to the other relative to the average. So 1 is the average level of possible automation. How susceptible each of these sectors are to being automated. So food manufacturing, we're probably going to see more robots doing some of it. Agriculture, we can probably see more robots doing some of it. Domestic staff, people are not going to have robots as their cooks and their chefs, again, we're in Kensington, doing that in the same degree. It can't be automated in the same way. And now is the time for firms to start thinking about how are they going to respond to this big change in the labour market for the coming years. So that's our overall take is the robots are coming, it turns out. You've met some of them. They bring with them challenges in specific sectors, but they also bring with them opportunities for higher living standards for the population as a whole. We need a good policy response both to those dislocated during the transition, and then we need to decide what we do when robots could be the answer to some of our broader policy challenges. I'm also using robots in the broadest possible sense. So, that's the resolution foundations take. Now let's get some actual experts here. Right, those slides I showed you at the beginning with the headlines, just to give you a flavour, one of them was from the New York Times in 1928. There is no such thing as new angst, which we all should have known. Middle class angst was never going away. They were anxious in 1928 because the march on the machines were going to people out of their jobs. This one, the robot was after your job, I think is from 1980. PM actually counter chips that kill jobs is from 1978. That was when the computers were going to wipe out every job in the planet. Automation in Britain stirs unrest in Labour. Labour spelt wrong. You see what I mean? We've always been anxious about this. Yes, it's hard. Yes, there can be challenges, and our angst is not going to go away. But you know, there's some good goodies to have as well if we get it right. Great. Alan.
Thank you very much for that. Actually, a lot of it sort of feeds quite well into what I'm going to say. So, I'm an economist at the LSE, specialising in labour market issues. And when as a labour economist you read a lot of the material about the impact of new technology or robots on the labour market, I think the first thing that strikes someone like me is the almost complete absence of economics from the discussion. Now you may well think that's a very good thing. I mean, if you walk around this museum, you walk around the street outside and you think about the way what was there 50 years ago, 100 years ago, 500 years ago, 5,000 years ago, every aspect of the way in which the world has changed almost entirely, we think, for the better, is from new technology, from scientists thinking of a new way of doing something or a better way of doing something other. And I'm not quite sure that economists can make the claim to have had such a beneficial effect on human welfare. And obviously we've just had over a Bruisey referendum campaign in which you were told by an English graduate, I think, that most people have had quite enough of economic experts. So I hope you're not all most of the people, but maybe you are. So what I want to do really is try to explain economists' perspectives on the impact of new technology on the labour market. And I will try, I'll try to persuade you that now my first set of notes here, thinking it was a more techie crowd than usual, was actually to put in a few lines of algebra and a little bit of differential calculus, thinking that the scientists among you would understand that. I think those slides will kind of may go up on the website afterwards. But it really is, what I would sort of say is that I think it's really helpful here, people, scientists sort of thinking very deeply, systematically, logically about things in their sort of professional life with robots and so on. You need to, but when we talk about the effects on the labour market, we seem to sort of lose that sort of systematic way of thinking about things. So I'm going to try and sketch to you the way in which economists think about this and what they think is important. So the sort of very stylised way. Now I should say that sort of economic models, equations don't have the same status as they do in physical systems, but they do help us focus on, if you don't like the conclusion that follows from this sort of assumptions, which of the assumptions do you think are wrong and which do you want to change? So first of all, if we just think we're interested in producing stuff, and we use labour to do that, and we use machines to do that, and then there's sort of new technology. And when we have new technology, really what that means is that it means two things. One of which is totally uncontroversial, which is that we can make more stuff with the same amount of labour and capital that we had before. New technology means we can do things better than we used to be able to. So that's really uncontroversial. What is more controversial and has figured in every debate since Aristotle, Torsten pointed these out, about debates about what is the impact of new technology on the world of work, on the demand for labour, has been about when we have a new technology, does it make labour less important in producing output, meaning that it substitutes for human labour? Or is it make human labour more important, meaning that it's sort of complementary to it? So we work with a machine to produce more labour. And the perspective and most of the discussions are about, I think you can say that the discussions we're having at the moment about robots is they think it's all about substituting, displacing labour, and so on and so forth. And when people say, well, why were people so wrong in the past about the impacts of new technology, when, as Torsten said, they predicted again the end of work multiple times over the last several hundred years. The thing is, people say, oh, it's different. Technology is different now. It's substituting for labour much more, whereas in the past it was complementary to labour. But the economist's perspective on that is that whether it is actually substitutes for labour or is complementary is actually, in the long run, irrelevant for whether people are made better or worse off on average by it. What's relevant is whether new technology allows us to produce more stuff than we could before. And the answer to that question is, yeah, we do think it can make us produce more stuff. And that's sort of what is the insight in economics. And you can sort of show that using just a few lines of algebra, which I'm not going to do now, but if anyone wants to, they're very welcome. Well, I'll try and kind of give an intuition for why that's the case. So I'll ask you to think about the Resolution Foundation meeting it had 3,500 years ago, when the wheel had just been invented. It probably actually, the Resolution Foundation wasn't going there. It's the Stonehenge Foundation. The Druids all sat around and somebody had just invented the wheel and they debated what the effect was that going to be on people's work. And there are these people who argued, well, this is going to be very bad for the demand for labour, because previously we've used all these people to push and pull these giant stones to erect Stonehenge, and now we just don't need so many of them to do that because we've got a wheel instead. Now, in some sense, that's right. The demand for pushers and pullers of stone went down with the invention of the wheel. But the important point is, and again, Torsten made this point very well, is that that doesn't mean that those people who had previously been the pushers and pullers of labour sat around being idle. They were redeployed to some other activity. And as we did that, we got the same sort of Stonehenge as we did before, but we got more of some other stuff because of those redeployed workers are doing other things. And it is really quite striking how very simple points like that are almost often completely omitted from these discussions. Now, I'll update the example a little bit. So, what happens when a firm introduces robots? Well, what it means is that, why is the firm doing that? They're doing that because robots are cheaper than people. So what does that mean? That means that their costs of production are going down. So what does that mean for the prices of the goods those firms produce? It means they go down as well. So what does that mean for the consumers of those goods? It means they can buy those goods cheaper than they could before. So now they can buy the goods, and now they've got some more money left over. Now, what are they going to do with that money? They're going to go out and spend it on other things. And as they do that, they're going to create jobs for other people. Often in these discussions, people say, well, what are the new jobs that people are going to do? But they're not primarily going to be new jobs. They're just going to be more old jobs. If the fact you can buy a car is now cheaper because it's produced by robots and the car factories are more productive, you can go out and buy more haircuts. You can go out and have more therapy sessions. I'll probably go for the latter rather than the former, but anyway. And so on. As you do, you create jobs for hairdressers, for therapists, and so on. And so the problem is that often when people are discussing the labour market impact of technology, there are losers, as Torsten said. They're often very visible and very readily identified. It's the workers who have lost their jobs because the jobs that they were doing are now done by a robot. But what people don't see is all these extra jobs, all these extra hairdressers that are actually only there because of the new technology, even though it sounds absurd to make that claim. But we have more hairdressers now because of robots in car manufacturing. But it's actually true. This is the most important point. So, you know, it's just incredible how often that simple point, as goods become cheaper, people spend the money that they've got left over on other things, creating jobs for other people, is not present from these discussions. But that is the thing that economists would point to as being, in the long run, the most important way in which labour is redeployed from sectors where it's perhaps being displaced to other sectors. Now, there are, as Torsten said, going to be lots of, you know, there will probably be some losers from this. So although on average people gain, workers gain, I think there are often some types of workers who lose. And you know, we do have to think about policy really to making sure that people, you know, all benefit. And so I don't want to sort of you to have the takeaway that everybody automatically gains from new technology. If you have a specific skill that was valuable is no longer valuable because a robot can do the job that you did, you will be a loser from the introduction of robots. But the point is that in the sort of medium to long run, what happens is the benefits of robots in terms of lower costs last forever. Young people simply no longer go into those professions. So although there are some people who lose right now, in the medium term, those losses sort of dissipate. So what I would really say is that please, when people are writing about the impact of robots on the labour market, don't use a sort of superficial analysis which just says, oh, this robot is doing a job that this person was doing before, and therefore it must be bad for the demand for labour, and the only question is how bad? Is it the end of work as we know it? Because if you do that, you're really making the mistake for why all those people in the past who predicted that new technology was going to cause the end of work were wrong. And there are, you know, so that's what I would, you know, the main thing that I would say. I would say that I think there are serious issues here about the way in which technology is changing our economy. But I actually think they're more about ownership of intellectual property and ideas and so on and so forth, which are not really about technology directly. They're the way about our market institutions. So I do think there's a problem that new technology may be leading to less competition in many of our markets, and that may be problematic. But that's not an essential feature of the technology. So I'll just stop there. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
The good news is that's the last of your slides, so it's going to, Alan, you're going to come sit here, because you're now on the stage. So Orna is now going to give us, having had two economists for you, Orna is now going to give you the real world example of someone who's been busy running companies.
Thank you very much. Can you hear me at the back? Yeah. Yes? Good. Okay, I'm just going to talk a little bit about retail and then make a few points along the following lines. The number of jobs in retail is falling very fast, and the rate of fall is going to accelerate over the next few years. That's largely due to technology, including robots, including more broadly automation. Are other jobs replacing them, as we've just heard should happen? To some extent they are, in some very obvious areas, but there will be increasing pressure on one of those areas, which is transport. Could other jobs replace jobs that leave us in retail and transport? Are we running out of tasks that people could do? No, we're not. But at present, we don't value those jobs, and we don't have funding models to pay for them. I'm not going to talk about that third point because it will take too long, and I know you want to have a chance for questions and answers at the end. So let me just talk about the number of jobs in retail. It's falling fast, and it matters because retail has traditionally offered a lot of low-skilled jobs and currently employs 3 million people in the UK. It has lost 200,000 jobs in the past 6 years, and the industry expects a loss of 900,000 jobs in the next 8 years. In fact, many retail leaders think it could be higher. Deloitte says 2/3 of retail jobs could go in the next 20 years. The cause is the internet, e-commerce, which retailers have to offer to compete with the pure plays. And pure plays don't employ many people. Unfortunately for large retailers, you create a huge duplication of cost structures and effort because they still have their high-cost stores full of staff, but they have in parallel a high-cost picking, packing and delivery system. and falling sales due to those pure plays and because of pricing pressure. Moreover, the customer expects to get the goods at a very modest delivery charge and ideally on the day of ordering. So as a result, retail profit margins are crashing and are predicted to continue to do so. Independent stores are simply going out of business, and large chains are closing stores as fast as they can, consolidating into large population centres. There are 40,000 fewer shops in the UK today than there were 10 years ago, and there's a prediction that there will be 70,000 fewer shops in 10 years than there are today, out of about 250,000. So it's a pretty dramatic effect. But they're also taking jobs out of stores. You've all seen and used self-checkouts, and that means there are far fewer checkout people in the stores than there were. And they're taking out jobs out of warehouses due to automation of picking and packing. That includes a lot of robotisation, and there are a lot of players, including Ocado and Amazon, as the most obvious, most extreme ones, where there are no people in very large sections of their warehouses. So, let me just mention a couple of other points around retail productivity. Productivity per person is rising because of all that automation. But the shops, as I said, are falling. They're predicting there'll be 9% fewer shops in London, so we barely notice the effect here in our little bubble. But it will be 29% fewer shops in Wales. It's the poorer economic areas that are losing the shops, as the shops all go to the bigger centres. So retailers hope for fewer but better jobs. But my suspicion is they'll just end up with fewer, because the profitability simply doesn't support it. It means every retail leader is thinking all the time, how do I get the jobs out? How do I get the costs down? How do I automate? Can I get more robotisation into my warehouse? Can I get the picking onto shelves, the shelf stocking robotised, and so on. Now the UK is well ahead of the US and Europe in the penetration of e-commerce for a large number of reasons, so we can't really learn lessons from how others are doing it. People need jobs though. The idea that we'd all sit around saying it's fantastic, we don't have to work, I think is for the birds. People need to feel useful. They need to feel that they have a role in society, far more than just hanging out with their families. Keeps them out of trouble, if you want to say that. So are there jobs replacing these retail jobs? You saw Torsten show employment's going up, so clearly this disaster in retail is just a disaster in retail, and they're all going off to these other sectors. But the statistics include the self-employed, and they include people on 0 hours contracts. I think Resolution Foundation has shown that there are over 800,000 people on 0 hours contracts, so the quality of the employment is much harder to gauge. I want to talk very briefly about transport, because employment is undoubtedly growing in transport, but reflect on the major pillars of that, which all of you have seen. Firstly, people are hired to deliver all those e-commerce parcels. The challenge is that these are often 0 hours jobs or freelance jobs. At Royal Mail, we employ 120,000 postmen, but we're competing with couriers who are paying freelancers to deliver at a price per parcel. They're paying for their own petrol, they get no holiday pay, no sick pay, and we know our cost per parcel delivered is higher than those people. Luckily, we have scale on our side for now, but it's a huge problem for players like us. And the retailer is the funder of those couriers. All those parcels are coming from retailers, and those hard-pressed retailers are trying to take the cost of delivery down as fast as they possibly can. And if driverless cars were to come along to help that, I tell you, those retailers would be grabbing them very fast. And I mentioned driverless cars because I want to finish by mentioning Uber, a huge employer. 30,000 Uber drivers estimated to be on the streets of London now. And if those of you who didn't realise they all drive Priuses, well, go and look at how many Priuses are on the road. Those are all Uber drivers. Go to their website, it says you could make £565 per week as an Uber driver. Multiply that by 46 weeks if you want to give yourself 4 weeks holiday, some bank holidays off, you get to £26,000, out of which you'll be paying fuel, insurance, I assume the 20% Uber charge. So that's not quite as good a job as a career. And so I don't think the parcel couriers and Uber drivers between them are going to offset the million jobs that we're going to lose in retail. If they do, it'll only be at an extremely low pay rate. And if you throw driverless cars into the mix, which retailers desperately want, which consumers desperately want, where will the Uber driver be? They won't be in a Prius. There are other classes of big employers that are falling fast. Call centres, because automation and problem solving via internet is far more satisfactory to customers. Hotels, Airbnb has turned everyone into a host, but also a concierge and a chambermaid on the side. And there are whole other areas that are cutting through like that. I do see huge space for more haircuts, beauty treatments, cappuccinos, and the high street is indeed filling with those, but I'm not sure that they can go on ad infinitum. I have some views on what other jobs could emerge to replace these, but I do want to keep things short and not overrun too much. So I'll stop there and you can ask me in the Q&A if you really want to hear about the concept. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Orna. There's just one specific thing you raised, which is about retailers closing in some parts of the country where their margins are low, which, as you say, are poor parts of the country. Those are the examples that are worth dwelling on when we talk about this distribution impact, because if you look at where lower skilled women, parent mums in particular, work in some chunks of the country, they work part-time in retail, almost scarily exclusively in some parts of the country. So there are, these distributional things are real, even if Alan and I sound rather happy-clappy about the future of work. Now, Michael, you are basically a celebrity in Robotgate over the last few years, because you and your colleague have basically taken this issue and made it into a global phenomenon. Would you like to justify yourself?
Well, thanks, Torsten. And of course, Torsten mentioned before this cottage industry that's emerged in writing about the impact of machine learning and robotics on employment. And if I were to give a case study of how the impact of writing about machine learning and its effect on employment has the impact it's had on actual employment, I can consider my own individual data point, which is to say that I certainly haven't got rich as a result of this, but my job has got a lot more interesting. And as an academic, that's really all I can ask for. So there's a positive impact, at least that effect. So of course, my day job is in machine learning. I'm one of these engineers that Alan was mentioning is perhaps not ideally suited to writing about economics, a limitation I'm constantly aware of and commenting on this issue. But I thought it might be useful for this audience to provide some sort of definition of exactly what machine learning is. So one way to define machine learning is to give it its far less sexy name, which is computational statistics. So really what machine learning is about is taking a data set, finding patterns and trends within it, performing inference, and ultimately perhaps taking decisions upon it. So when you put it in that sort of way, it doesn't sound very exciting, but of course what we've seen in recent years is an explosion of data. So this is really what has underpinned most of the impacts of machine learning that we've been talking about this afternoon. It's not necessarily due to significant advances in the algorithms themselves, it's more due to the increasing availability of data enabling the automation of work. So to put some numbers to that phenomenon, you can consider the following estimates of information content. The first is the information contained in all the printed material in the world today. So that number is about 200 petabytes. The second estimate is of the information contained in all the words that are spoken by human beings, which is about 5 exabytes. Both of those figures, while enormous, are completely dwarfed by our best estimate of how much data was generated in 2013, which was about 4.4 zettabytes. So we really are seeing data at a scale completely unlike what we've seen in the past. That only seems to be accelerating. And as a result, we're seeing the automation of work through the use of data to substitute for human knowledge and kind of tacit skills. To give a concrete example, consider machine translation. So for a long time, translation from one language to another of written text was seen as beyond the scope of what could be done with algorithms, simply due to the kind of depth of cultural knowledge that a human carries around in their head completing that task. Of course, I'm sure that today many of you have used services like Google Translate, and I'm sure that if you've used it recently, you won't have thought that it's a complete substitute for a human translator, but you've probably been reasonably impressed. And that's because Google is drawing upon something like 200 billion words from the official documents of the UN, which is, of course, by its charter required to translate all its documents into its 6 different constituent languages. So by drawing upon those translations, finding the patterns and trends, an algorithm can reproduce much of the work that a translator might once have been asked to perform. So in a similar way, working within machine learning, we're seeing the impact of algorithms on Sales, as we've heard from Orna, that is algorithms drawing upon the data sets of spending patterns of millions of consumers are able to actually do something better job of recommending products to customers. We're seeing algorithms that are able to process not just a small sample of a company's financial data, as might be performed by a human auditor, but are in fact able to dig through 100% of a company's financial data and are able to do it in real time. So these algorithms now provide perhaps superior auditing performance to that provided by a human. And then of course, we've just heard about the impact of mobile robotics, self-driving cars, developments that have been largely influenced by the developments in machine learning. And we heard about Uber. It's no coincidence that Uber is one of the largest investors in autonomous vehicle research, because of course they see the impact that these kinds of technologies can have for their business. So coming to our own work, trying to understand these trends, back in 2013, as Torsten illustrated, we tried to put some numbers to exactly how much of current employment might be at risk due to automation. And of course, as you saw, we found that 47% of current US employment is at high risk of automatability. The equivalent figure for the UK we found to be about 35%. So, of course, you might wonder what truth there is to those statements. And so we were gratified when our colleagues at Deloitte looked at what had actually happened in UK employment trends over the last 15 years and related that to our probabilities of automation. So what they found is by limiting their focus to the occupations that we found to be at highest risk of automation, there was indeed net job loss. That is, there were 800,000 jobs lost in those occupations that we found to be at highest risk of automation. Whereas at the other end of the spectrum, and speaking to Alan's point about the potential for new jobs to be created, in fact there were 3.5 million jobs that emerged in those occupations that we found to be most secure from automation. So I completely agree with Alan's point that we shouldn't neglect this job creation. But to me, the really alarming thing is how this impact on employment might be related to different measures of skill. In our original analysis, we provided a relationship between the probability of automation and an occupation's measure of skill. Now, what we found very clearly is that the more skilled an occupation is, as measured by either its average education attainment or its minimum wage, the lower its risk of automation was. To put a number to that, in the UK, the risk for occupations that earned less than £30,000 per year was 5 times higher than the risk for occupations that earned more than £100,000 a year. So quite a stark difference. Of course, what that analysis doesn't capture is the emergence of entirely new occupations, another thing that Alan was referring to, and we know that technology does create these entirely new jobs. To give some examples from the last 15 years, we've seen job titles like data scientists, we've seen social media interns as an occupation, and we've seen big data architects. But crucially, what you might intuitively note about those occupations is that they all require a relatively high degree of skill, and also importantly, they're not major engines of job growth. That is, there just aren't enough jobs as data scientists to replace the jobs of, say, truck drivers replaced by autonomous vehicles. Putting some numbers to that, there was a couple of studies from the economist Jeffrey Lin that looked at just how many jobs in the US were engaged in new occupations by decade. So in the 1980s, that figure was 8%. In the 1990s, the figure dropped to 4.2%. And in the 2000s, my co-author Carl Frey found that the number of jobs in the US that was engaged in new occupations had dropped to half of 1%. So these new occupations that are emerging aren't necessarily going to be enough to replace the swathe of occupations that are eliminated by the kinds of technologies I've described. So on that cheery note, I'll conclude. Thanks very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Michael. As well as being depressing, you managed to introduce the word zettabyte, which I've definitely never heard of. Zeta? What is a zettabyte?
10 to 21.
Oh, obviously, right. Perfect sense. Right. Sarah, what's your take on the FT's view?
Well, lovely that you ended on such a pessimistic note, because I want to try and inject a bit of optimism back into the room. So I'm the employment correspondent at the FT, which means I go to a lot of workplaces, I talk to a lot of employers and a lot of workers. And my feeling is this, like the problem that we have right now is not the rise of human-like robots. It's the fact that we have so many robot-like humans in all kinds of workplaces. If you go into a call centre, for example, or like a big kind of Amazon fulfillment warehouse, something like that, these jobs are miserable jobs because what we're using at the minute is kind of software in order to control work. We still use human workers, but we fit them up with these headsets, which means that they're told where to walk next, they're told go to aisle 2, walk to aisle 2, and they won't even trust you to count to the number of items you need to pick. So say the robot wants you to pick 20 things from this shelf, it will say pick 5. So you pick 5 and say done, and then it'll say pick another 5, so you pick another 5, and it'll do that 4 times because it doesn't even trust you to count to 20. So these are miserable jobs, okay? And my sense is that actually if we can replace them with robots, well that would be great, you know? Like, these jobs do not use the kinds of parts of our brains that we enjoy using. People do them because they need to live, and at the minute this is their best option to live, but it's not enjoyable to be walking 20 miles a day in a big retail warehouse. It's not enjoyable to be sitting on the phone, taking calls from angry customers like you guys will get all day, and following your very rigid script to try and sort of deal with those questions. So I think that actually the problem at the moment is we're too cheap as workers. We're very cheap, we're very flexible, we have these hands which mean that we're very good at kind of picking up different objects, and robots just aren't quite good enough yet. But I was at a panel on Friday with a robotics guy who, his whole company makes robotic hands that are very like human hands, and he was telling me that actually a lot of this warehouse work will probably go in the next few years because these hands are getting quite good. And I think we should celebrate that. I mean, as Alan said, the fact that some jobs disappear doesn't mean that all those people will be out of work. If you're a warehouse worker, maybe you're the equivalent of the person who pushed and pulled the stone in the Stone Age times. When the wheel comes along, / the robot who can work in an Amazon warehouse, you're not going to be unemployed, or you'll find something else to do because everyone's prices will go down. Therefore, we'll all be a bit richer, we'll spend more money, and there'll be new work, whether that's new jobs or whether that's jobs that already exist. But hopefully it'll be something that uses those parts of our brains that robots don't use very well, creativity, imagination, and those things are much more enjoyable. And then in terms of kind of higher skilled jobs, so I did, slightly foolishly, I agreed to do a journalism battle with an AI robot a few weeks ago called Emma. So we both wrote up the UK jobs data on a Wednesday morning at 9:30. And she was actually really good, much better than I had hoped. So she filed the story within 12 minutes. She kind of looked through all of the spreadsheets. She figured out what the story was. She knew that unemployment had gone up. She figured out what happened to wages. She wrote a story in full sentences with a bit of context. And my story, it took me like 35 minutes, so I was definitely behind her. But what comforted me was that her judgment was terrible. So my favourite bit was when she said that she had realised that the Brexit vote was coming and that this was important, but she predicted that it would be a real tailwind for the UK economy. So that kind of comforted me, and it made me think that actually, if we get to a point in which programmes can do bits of my job that are pretty boring, like the bit of my job that I don't really enjoy is kind of reading through a bunch of data and writing a very quick article about whether unemployment's